Creation is not making something out of nothing. Creation is actually transformation of energy, transformation of existing objects into something new. So imagine that what exists is units of consciousness, and these units of consciousness form themselves in different shapes and forms, different ways to form a certain object. So imagine that some units of consciousness formed themselves into a planet, and some formed themselves into plants and rocks, and everything we see was formed out of units of consciousness. Someone said that physical objects we see is like solidified thought. But in this world that we live in, the earth world, things are kind of like more solidified than not. When you cross over, you end up in like a spiritual world, and it just means that things are not as solidified. You can manifest things, you can change things from one into another much more easier. So a physical world is like where objects cannot be transformed from one into another very fast or very easily. It requires a process, like you have to go to work to earn some money, to buy some wood, to make a table. So you transform energy of the tree into the energy of the table, so to speak, but it takes a while to do it. When you cross over and you're in that other environment, like a spiritual world, you just think of it, the table, and it appears. So it's much easier to manipulate this living energy, in a sense. So imagine that there's these beings that are huge, because from some perspective there is no time, and so whatever happened or will happen in the future already is there. It already exists. So from one perspective, these beings grew up to be that big, but from a different perspective they already are, and they always were that big. So this being, this consciousness, it's more like a collective consciousness entity. It consists of many sub-consciousness. So you could say that you is this huge collective consciousness entity, and it consists of many of sub-you. And so whenever these living units of consciousness form into something, they form into a little part of you. Like, for example, a certain combination of DNA and a certain way these units of consciousness form equals you, this human you. And a different combination of DNA and a different combination of units of consciousness being formed equals another person. And so these people, you and another person, you belong to your bigger selves. And these bigger selves exist because over time, from a linear time perspective, units of consciousness have been forming into these little parts of you. And then over time, they like emerged a collective consciousness, which became a big you. So you put all these little parts of you together, and you create a big you, a collective consciousness, consisting of many of little you. But because the time is not linear, perspective exists, that big you already exists, and always was, actually, because the time or the existence is kind of like a circular. It's in a circle. It always was. There was never a time when nothing was. So this big you is formed from the little u's, and the units of consciousness form into different ways to shape into little u's and other people. Imagine that whatever could happen ever already happened. So existence, everything in it just is. So that if there was a possibility of another earth being shaped from the units of consciousness, then it already happened. And as it happens, it turns out that there were many earths formed by the units of consciousness. Because imagine existence as a circle. It basically shapes into the earth one time, shapes into something else another time, and it goes in a circle until it comes back and shapes into the earth again, because things are finite in some fashion, so there's only a certain number of ways it could turn out. It's a huge number, but it still ends at some point. So it starts to repeat. So units of consciousness form into different things, and eventually the same thing repeats. And that's why a different version of you, the same you, will be born at some point. But from the time is not linear perspective, this already happened, and all the versions of you already exist, and all the units of consciousness have formed into all the possible earths that they could ever form. This is difficult to explain, so bear with me. So units of consciousness form into little u's over time, which in turn emerges a big U. But because time does not exist from a certain perspective, the big U always existed. So let's say you are Alex. Units of consciousness have been forming over time to form little human Alexes all over the place. I mean, time is like huge. It goes on and on and on forever. It's a circle, so in a way it goes on forever basically. And so it just keeps forming Alex over time. It's hard to explain, I guess. You just have to take my word for it. So, but because time does not exist, this big Alex entity, multi-consciousness consisting of all these Alexes, already exists. And this big living entity can now, because it exists, can now send its seeds into humans to reincarnate. So this Alex entity takes a seed from itself and places into, let's say, Maria human. Maria human is a different DNA, different entity. It's not you. But your seed becomes merged with hers, and you become like a new creation in a way. And there are many different Marias. And I guess you just chose to reincarnate into one of her, one version of her. Not, well, that gets complicated again, so I'm gonna skip this. But basically, reincarnation is when this big entity you places its seed into a different human, different combination of DNA, not you, and merges it. And then when the reincarnation is done and the body dies, this unit comes back to you, becomes a part of you, merges with you. But this unit, who was like Maria and Alex together, it also has its own existence, because there is this big Maria entity, as you know. So this Maria entity belongs to its own bigger self, and Alex belongs to its own bigger self. But it's like now these two bigger selves share each other's identity a little bit. So Maria was added to the Alex entity collective, and Alex was added to the Maria entity collective.